Hello everybody, welcome to Module 4 of the Leveling Up program in the Bit by Bit series. In this module, we're going to import code from two different languages, Python and C++, and look at some of the differences in terms of the structure and the execution of these two scripts. Now, this is the second repo.it module, and if you have not completed the first one, which is located in the bootcamp program, we would highly recommend you do so before starting this module, as we are going to build on a lot of the concepts that were introduced in the initial iteration. So the first step is going to look very familiar. We're going to go to repo.it. Now, since we have an account, we are going to click login up here. Now you can use your email or your username to log in, and then go ahead, type your password in and click login. Now you should see the website start to show you some text again in this area, and the text may vary depending on how much of your account has been set up. Again, we don't need to worry about this. We're going to go up here and click new REPL. Click on the import from GitHub, and here we're going to type row4438 bit by bit leveling up. Just like that. So once you have this entered in, go ahead and click the green import from GitHub button. Now it's going to start loading in the code. Cloning means it's pulling data from the repository on GitHub. And we're going to see an interesting thing here in our configuration file. REPL.it defaulted to bash. And the reason for this is that REPL struggles when there's two different types of code in the same folder. And since we have a C++ file and a Python file, it's not sure which one to pick. So go ahead, click on bash right here, and you see the arrow, so you can click this, select Python, and then go ahead and enter the command the same way we did in the earlier program. So Python and then the file name, which is python file write.py. Go ahead and click done. You should see the upgrading to Python message, and things should start to load. And this should look very familiar from last time because we still have the terminal on the right side, and then we have our file directory or file structure over here, which now has 3 files instead of 2. We have our REPL.it file, which is a language, Python 3, and the run configuration command. Then we have a C++ file, which ends in .cpp, and then we have a Python file, which again ends in .py. Now, REPL seems to have a small bug where you cannot manipulate files immediately after importing code, and since both of our scripts are actually to write messages to files, we're going to go ahead and refresh the whole page. So up here, click reload this page. So everything should just go ahead and reload, and let's start with our Python file. So go ahead and click it, pull it up. Now here, just go ahead and type in clear one time and hit enter. Now we should have a clean pane, and to run it, we are going to use that configuration command because it's good practice. So go ahead and type in python file write.py. Now this script is going to say Python file writer starting, and since it says this right here, we know we're in the right script. And as I said earlier, this code is designed to take a message and save it to a file. So go ahead, enter a short little message. Hello, how are you doing? Is what I'm going to use, like this. Go ahead, click enter. Now it's going to ask you for the file name. So typically in coding, plain text files are stored in .txt file extensions. The cool thing about this code is it actually checks if you put .txt in the file name, it doesn't add it. But if you didn't, it does make sure to add it. So if we want to save our code to testfile.txt, we can just go ahead and type in testfile like this without the .txt ending, hit enter. You'll see the done and the orange cursor, so we're done executing. And you'll see a file here called testfile.txt. Go ahead and click it, and you'll see, hello, how are you doing? So the Python file works just fine. Now for the C++ file, if you remember from booklet 2, C++ has to be compiled to machine code before it can be run. You can't directly run it like Python, which is an interpreted language. Luckily for us, REPL comes with a built-in compiler called G++. So go ahead and type in G++. Now type in -o like this. And this is telling the code where to save our executable machine code. So we can go ahead and name it the same thing, C++ file write. Just don't give the .cpp ending because this is machine code and it's not going to be a C++ file anymore. And then we have to tell it what our initial script is, so C++ file write.cpp. So make sure not to get confused between these two. The .cpp is the actual script that we see here. Now we're saving this and converting it to machine code, which is just going to be C++ file write. Once you have this in, go ahead, click enter. You should see the C++ file write come up. And remember, this is machine code, it's not for humans. And if you try to read it, you'll see that most of it cannot even be displayed because it uses strange characters. That's okay for us though, because we have our code, we don't need to see the machine code. And to run an executable file, like the one we just created, we're going to put in dot dash and then the name. So C++ file write. You'll see C++ file writer starting, which is right here in our code, so we're in the right script. And we can enter our message, so we can do this is the C++ version, like that. Hit enter. We're going to enter our file name. This again has the same check right here in lines 13 through 15 to add.txt, but this time I'll show you we can actually add it ourselves and it will work just fine. So let's do second test file. Make sure not to name it the same as the Python test file because it will overwrite what's written in the file already. So second test file.txt, hit enter. You'll see the done and the orange cursor. So once again, we're out of the script. And then we'll see the second test file.txt right here. And it says this is a C++ version. So both scripts work correctly. Now let's go and look at some of the details within the scripts and how they might differ. So starting with the Python code, the first 3 lines, 1 through 3, are what we call a function. And the way to tell something is a function is with this keyword def. We're defining the function. And a function is used whenever we want to repeatedly do something and we don't want to have to retype it each time. We create a function and then just call the function whenever we want that specific code to run. In this case, our function takes in 2 parameters, file name, and in this case the text or the message is just called txt. So these are the 2 inputs we are passing into the code. And then this is just a syntax for opening a file and writing with a W. And then we write that message to the file. Now remember in booklet 2 that we talked about the 2 major aspects of coding, syntax and logic. Now syntax refers to the different words, the different functions that are used in code. So Python has its own set of functions, C++ has its own set, just like every other language has his or her own set. But the important thing to understand is that the logic should be more or less the same if the functionality is the same. And since both of our files clearly do the same thing, they should have the same flow or the same logic. So don't get too worried about the syntax differences, but instead think about some of the differences in the logic and in the layout of the code. So the next part is on line 5, we have this if name equals main. This is something that we will talk about in more detail later on, but right now we don't need to worry about it. Inside we can see that we have a print for the Python file writer starting, and then we have 2 variables, our message and our file name. And these variables are not declared beforehand. They're immediately created as we enter the input, which you can see right here. And they are assigned to the string type, which we'll also discuss in the future. And then one of the coolest things is on line 9. So Python lets you do backwards slicing of a string. And what that means is it lets you find specific substrings within a longer piece of text and let you check what value they have. So here we can see that the last 4 characters have the value .txt, and if not, then we add them. Then we call our function write to file, which does what was in lines 1 through 3, and then we print done. So one of the important things to know about Python is that there's no semicolons. There's nothing at the end of each line that tells the code the line is over. And so that's why Python has a very strict indentation format. This means that if I'm in an if statement like here, where I only want to run something if another condition is true, I have to use a colon and then I have to indent the next however many lines that I want within that if statement. So you can see all of this has been indented over because of the if name equals main. these lines have been indented over because of this def for our function. And you'll notice if I try to mess with the indentation at all, our code will not run. Let's say I move this message back, I add a tab here, and then I go ahead and try to click run. So Python file write.py, click enter, I'll get an indentation error. Unindent does not match any outer indentation level. So immediately the code throws an error and it cannot run. So that's why indentation is crucial in Python, because it's the only way for the code to actually know when a new line is starting and when the previous line has ended. So now we can move to our C++ file, and we can already start to notice some differences. We do see a function or something that resembles a function called main up here, which is also what we saw in the Python script. But within the actual code, we see this cout with the carets, and this is actually the way to print messages in C++. And you can already see that it's not as intuitive as the actual function of print. Now we have our message and file name, and you can see right here we've had to initialize them before, and then we can only use them later. So we've created them here and we've said that they are strings, but then we're actually going to get them later. Now we continue on, we can use getLine to get a whole line, or we can just use the other direction to save a value into a variable. Then here we have lines 13 through 15, we have a similar if statement to check the last 4 characters of the string, but we cannot use backward slicing in C++. So we actually have to get the length and find the exact location of the last 4 characters, which is something that is not as easy to use as Python slice. Then we're going to do a very similar thing here. We're going to open our file, then we're going to write to it using this operator, and then we're going to close the file. Then finally we end with a done message. So one of the things you can clearly see are these semicolons after each line. So Python doesn't have them, but C++ does. And so that also means that C++ does not care about indentation that much. So the other reason that C++ doesn't care about indentation as much is because they use these brackets, the fancy curly brackets. So you can see them here in the if statement and in the main function here. And so what this tells us is that everything within the brackets is part of this function. So for example, if I go ahead and tab this over 2 times, and maybe I want to tab this 1 time, and I backspace this 1 time. Now in Python, this would have broken the code as we saw. But here, we're going to have to compile it 1 time. So you can use the up arrow key to get used commands, so G++, and go ahead and compile it. It will change, and then go ahead and run it, and it will run fine. So we can do enter our message, hello, this is updated, and then we can do another test.txt, and it still works. We can see another test.txt right here. And so C++ has its own advantages and disadvantages, but really the main thing is that Python has an easier structure for beginners to understand. It operates in a way that the human brain often does, and thus for beginners it's easier to get started with Python. Functions like print are very easy to understand what they're doing. With open is very easy to understand. And so that is why in future books we're going to take a deeper look into Python and start learning the more intricacies about the language. But C++ also has its advantages. A single indentation error does not break the code, and the code doesn't need to be as structured in terms of the way it looks line by line. However, you do have to enter a semicolon, you do have to use these brackets, which can sometimes become cumbersome. And finally, you have to compile the code each time. So hopefully this module showed you a little bit about the differences between 2 different languages, C++ and Python, which are both very important and widely used. And it showed you how, even for the same task, there are some subtle differences in terms of their execution. Thanks for watching.